And welcome back to the Wellness Paradox podcast. I'm so grateful that you can join us on this journey towards greater human flourishing. As always, I'm your host, Michael Stack, an exercise physiologist by training and a health entrepreneur and a health educator by trade. And I'm fascinated by a phenomena I call the wellness paradox. This paradox, as I view it, is the trust, interaction, and communication gap between fitness professionals and our medical community. This podcast is all about closing off that gap by disseminating the latest, most evidence-based, and most engaging information in the health sciences. And to do that, in episode 47, we're joined by physical therapist Ray Gorman. Now, Ray is no longer a practicing physical therapist. He's developed a training and business model and a company based upon his observations in the PT space as well as in the fitness space. And this conversation gets really interesting, surprisingly so, because not only do we talk about coaching principles, but we talk about business principles and then exercise prescription principles. And although we do bounce around a little bit during the conversation, I think much of the information that Ray talks about is underappreciated by many fitness professionals. And I think this is going to be a great look under the hood of several critical aspects of how to build a sustainable, profitable, and impactful fitness or personal training business. Any information that we want to share from this episode can be found on the show notes page by going to wellnessparadoxpod.com/episode 47. Please enjoy this conversation with Ray Gorman. Today, we're delighted to be joined by Ray Gorman. Ray, thank you so much for joining us.
Mike, thanks for having me.
Really excited for this discussion because, as all of our listeners know, this is about how we get fitness and wellness professionals onto the healthcare continuum. And I think, Ray, you're going to bring a very interesting perspective to this discussion based on some of the conversations that we've had off air. And I want to jump right into it with giving our listeners a little bit of an idea of what your background is like for some context before we dive into the meat of this discussion.
Absolutely. So I'm a physical therapist by trade, but I don't actually practice clinically anymore. So my journey kind of started in 2008, where I really kind of was into the fitness space through CrossFit. Mm-hmm. I always knew that I wanted to remain in the fitness space, but didn't know how. Ended up tearing my ACL in college, and that's kind of the route of a lot of physical therapists experience is you get hurt and you're like, oh, I want to do this for people. Went and worked clinically after I graduated and just kind of really wasn't my place yet. Went into sports medicine and learned a lot of cool stuff. But in that process, I had started my own cash pay clinic and really started to hone in on this niche of clients that I wanted to help. And ultimately found that I couldn't scale my impact in the way that I really, really desired to. And so now I'm kind of doing more of the education process and more of the mentoring process, where if I can educate a coach, I can scale my impact to, 100x.
Yeah. And I think that everyone in helping professions has that moment where they think, how can I really scale my impact? Because when you're working with a patient or a client one-on-one, you realize that's a very rate limiting proposition. But when you can mentor someone who will mentor others, that's to some degree the gift that keeps on giving. And let's talk about that part of your journey. I know you've recently made some transitions, and we were talking before the episode about how things are evolving. So let's talk a little bit more about Engage Movement, Physio, and Performance, and what the mission of the organization is, who it serves, and then in general, what you're doing right now.
Yeah, the mission of the company has really evolved into educating coaches and rehab professionals and employing them with strategies to navigate conversations to keep clients active and to figure out what are kind of the behind the scene things that are tying into this person's life that are maybe being expressed in the gym or expressed in the clinic. When somebody has knee pain, that's just one of the things going on. What are kind of the things underneath the surface that are driving them to make lifestyle choices, training decisions that are contributing to that knee pain, for example? And that's really become the mission of, let's bridge this gap from rehab back to performance, keep that person active, keep that person moving. And that's kind of been the new, moniker of the movement in Engage Movement.
Yeah. And so just to make sure that I capture it for our audience, it sounds like what you're really interested in doing is helping those fitness and exercise professionals that are out there that are looking to work with a post physical therapy patient, in many cases, transition them away from the care of the PT at the end of their time, and then to more of a fitness or a performance setting. Is that how you would characterize what your business is designed to do?
That's definitely a part of it. There's also an area where coaches and trainers can make really smart modifications to training that solve similar problems without bleeding over the scope line.
Got it.
One of the things that I always say is this isn't about creating a turf war. It's about understanding that the relationship and the level that we can have with clients can be sometimes limited by the environment that we interact with them in.
Yeah, that's great. And that's exactly where I was hoping you were going to go, because we've had a lot of different guests on the podcast, and some of our conversations are very philosophical and abstract, and I think important conversations. That's not going to be this conversation. This is going to be an exceedingly tactical conversation for our listeners, where they're actually going to be able to take something away from this model that you've developed. And that's where I want to go next. I want to start to unpack this. So on a very broad level, and we can, I'm sure, dive very deep, when and if appropriate, but just on a broad level, talk a little bit about your model and your philosophy that you teach. What's important for our audience of fitness professionals to know?
So the framework of the model is kind of built around what I call the client attribute profile. And it's essentially this group of characteristics that everybody kind of has and presents within the gym. So for example, passive range of motion, active range of motion, strength, endurance, lifestyle, technique, and mindset. And the way that I explain this is, if you're putting together a football team, the attribute profile of the lineman is not going to be the same as the wide receiver. They don't solve the same problems for the team. So when we're looking to create this big picture for the client, it really gives the coach or rehab professional some conversation guidance. And I actually just got off this call where it's like, how do we tangibly look at something like lifestyle, right? Like it's kind of out there, whereas range of motion, strength, we can tangibly look at those things. Well, what I want to know is, why is that person potentially squatting 5 days a week? Why is that person potentially training 6 days a week? Is that a lifestyle indication? Is that a mindset indication? And I can't just go look at the pain. I've got to understand the context of why those things are really happening.
Yeah, that's interesting. So this is definitely a more holistic approach. And what it gets me to think of is, and we've had a couple of guests on from the American College of Lifestyle Medicine. We've had Tom Rafai on, David Katz on, Kate Collins, who's the current president of the ACLM. And their approach is somewhat similarly holistic, although slightly different than yours. And I think that's a very, very important approach, because people don't live in a vacuum. You don't train in a vacuum. You don't live in a vacuum. What led you to this? I feel like, there are a lot of professionals in the field observed challenges, but what led you to creating this model? And after you answer that, I do have some questions around what you just talked about, but let's first unpack that. Like, what got Ray to say, hey, I need to look at this more holistically?
A series of events that resulted in me learning what I didn't like. So and also taking from those things the things that I did. My first job was great. I learned a ton about customer service, and I learned a ton about customer service in the healthcare industry, which really wasn't a thing that I thought of prior to that. But ultimately, the constraints of that clinic and the client population I was seeing, it wasn't energizing for me. And then going into Division I athletics, this seems like the dream. And it was great, but it still had that clinical constraint to it. But I learned a ton about tendinopathy and return to sport. And that was kind of the thing that my clientele was missing in my cash-based clinic. So it's taking those concepts and saying, well, how do we look at returning to sport on the field with something like performing squats, or with something like conditioning pull-ups, or with something like reconditioning CrossFit? How do we start to do those things? And then the next company that I started to work for was more interacting with coaches and more interacting with professionals. And there were some theories and models from there that I liked, but I was still constrained by what the vision of that company was. And so for me, it was like, the only way that I'm going to be able to do this and do this the way that makes sense to me and do this the way that I'm able to explain it and really be authentic with it is going to be doing that myself.
Yeah. And I think so many entrepreneurs have that spirit, which is, I like this, that's not quite it. I like this, that's not quite it. And the Goldilocks zone ends up being the thing that you create on your own. Now, to go back to earlier, you talked about assessing these different attributes about clients and particularly assessing their lifestyle. And I'm curious for you to unpack that a little bit more. What are some of the methods that you use to do that? And I'd like you to be as specific as you can, given the fact we're on a podcast.
Sure.
I'd love people to be able to walk away with, that's an insightful way for me to look more broadly at the person in front of me than just their body composition or their hamstring range of motion.
So it's really just a series of reflective questioning and understanding what that person's day-to-day, week-to-week life looks like. And then it's also re-engaging them and saying, well, what are your expectations of what you think you should be experiencing? Because oftentimes there's a mismatch in the environment and the context that that person is trying to operate in and the thing that they want to do. So an example of that is if we're looking to create sustainability and you're staying up late because you have a newborn, but you're also trying to go to the gym at 5 a.m. and then you're feeling smoked for the rest of the day, like that's not sustainable. So how can we figure out how to make fitness a sustainable part of your current lifestyle? Is it maybe that we break up your hour into 15-minute bouts? Is it maybe that 30 minutes of fitness actually gets you the same benefit of an hour? But I'd rather you be sleeping and rested than just perpetually smoked for the entire day. So that's really the look at it is, do you have enough fuel? Do you have enough sleep? What's your mindset around those things? All of those come into play in the big picture.
So it sounds like a great deal of at least the initial part of your process when you're coaching people how to implement the system is actual coaching communication skills. It's having those coaching conversations with clients. Is that accurate?
Yeah. So we actually don't get into any assessment tactics in my group course until week 4. Because it doesn't really matter. If we can't communicate what we're looking to find, if we can't create the relationship to create trust and make this a process of learning, that's an assessment skill.
Yeah.
Right. And I always tell people like there's value in just the conversation. And your client is generally going to feel better before you even do anything. So let's just sit back and let them get everything off their chest and start painting that picture for the client. But absolutely, I mean, communication is the foundation to the framework.
Yeah. Well, so let's start to walk through a little bit of how your course works. Let's kind of, look
Yeah.
under the hood and maybe just kind of go week by week on a really high level. So people, I think, can understand not just what the course does, but I think maybe we can get them to extract some principles that they might be able to use, even if they don't engage with the course.
So I think the biggest problem that I find in the beginning is too often people are looking at what service they provide without understanding who they first want to serve.
Mm-hmm.
So we start the course by creating this client avatar and really getting them dialed in on understanding the customer journey, how they can kind of have these areas of opportunity where you can find an opportunity for conversation, you can find an opportunity for engagement, and some kind of indicators if that person is looking to work with you. For example, somebody's in a group fitness class and is grabbing their shoulder. How do we engage with that person in a way that's, my goal isn't to sell them something. My goal is to figure out if they need my help. And if they don't need my help, my goal is to figure out who's the person that can actually help them. Then we go into a little bit more of the framework. And then we go into what I call consultative sales.
Mm-hmm.
So what's the process of having a conversation with somebody and not convincing them to work with you, but getting them to the point where they're actually deciding to work with you? And so from there, we're into more of the tactics. What does their range of motion look like? What does their strength profile look like? What's the programming process to bridge the gap? Tendon health, return to sport. And then we wrap it up by, having this a practical assignment with a real client.
Yeah, I find that is a very accurate framework based upon my experience in the industry. It's, they have to know you, they have to like you, they have to trust you, and then you can get in to all of the tactical elements of putting together a program. I'm curious to drill down on that consultative element, because I feel like a lot of fitness professionals struggle with that component. They're thinking of it from a sales perspective, which in some sense it is, but in other senses, that's not exactly the right lens to look at it through. So teach for a second on how you express that to fitness professionals in terms of not selling their service to get to somebody, but getting that person to actually want to work with them. How do you break that up in your framework?
I think it's something that I've been working on with one of my coaches, is this process of commitment versus performance. If I go into a sales consultation or a sales call with performance on my mind, my goal is to close the sale. That's just inherently performance-based. If I go into the call with commitment on my mind, it's figuring out, is this person actually a fit? Does the environment contextually make sense for them to commit to working together? And for me, that was like a game changer of, man, I didn't close the sale, I failed. To maybe the sale wasn't actually meant to be closed because the environment wasn't correct. And I do think that there's a fine line of, did we kind of just get objected out of the sale? Mm-hmm. But a high pressure sales situation has never felt good to me. And so it's never the way that I want to teach it. It's never the way that I want to go about my business. And in just getting to know people and asking questions and leading them a little bit more to understanding what's the problem that they have. What's the cost if they don't act? What else are they going to do if they don't act? If we can kind of navigate those waters, it becomes like, how do I work with you? Instead of, this is why you should work with me.
Yeah, that's the subtle, but very, very important mind shift there. It's the person, the client, the prospective client making the decision, not you trying to make the decision for them. Let's back up a little bit. I realize I'm going backwards here, but something you said triggered it in my mind. You talked about helping professionals build this avatar of who they're going to work with. And I've always said in business, I've been in the fitness business for 23 years now. I've always said in business, it's just as important to know who your customer isn't as it is to know who your customer is. But there is this counter view that says, a generalist is great and don't pigeonhole yourself and try to be all things to all people. So both of those philosophies exist out there. Just talk a little bit about that avatar building process and why you feel it's so important right out the gate to identify the type of individual you're going to work with.
I think it leads you to feel more comfortable in that consultative sales process. Like, I think when we're having this conversation about sales or the avatar, you kind of know who the person is that you want to help and how you want to help them. And just because I can help you doesn't necessarily mean that I should. So what's the energy expenditure for me versus a referral that does all the things that that person needs? So an example of this is I had a client reach out to me, and I used to do a lot of online coaching and programming. And he reached out to me because he tore his ACL. And I was like, dude, like, I know that you want to work with me and like I could help you, but I've got somebody that this is all that they're doing. Mm-hmm. And I would way rather you go work with them. And even better, I mentored them so I can vouch for the service that they provide. And it was really cool because I saw a video of him doing a squat snatch and Olympic lift today. And to me, that was like, I just served that client in the absolute correct way. And when I followed up with him, it was, hey, like, I want to explore some things about what you're actually doing now. Yeah. Because I put him into the right service that he needed. So it's not about creating this perfect person where we're just excluding anybody that doesn't fit that mold, but it's about understanding, like, what's the context of the person that I want to work with? What's the level of engagement that we need? What's the level of commitment needed from them? Is the problem big enough of a problem to them that they're ready to engage in the service with me? Those are more of kind of the navigating factors of that.
Yeah, something that you said there really stuck out, and it's what's the energy expended to work with a given individual. And yeah, it took me back, a flashback to when I was 19 years old, which was not yesterday, that's for sure. And I worked with a gentleman who was post-stroke. And I remember realizing in that moment that I definitely didn't want to do physical therapy because the energy that I had to expend to work with him, I often used to say, and he was a great guy, but working with him for an hour was like working with 4 hours of clients. It was just so energy intensive. But at that time, the mantra was, hey, whoever you get for a client, get them, sell them, train them. And I didn't realize the sacrifice I was making there in terms of energy. And I think that's a really good takeaway for our audience, is that if you're not working with the right person, this is probably true in any aspect of life, not just training, it is going to be a disproportionate amount of energy expended that may very well not be worth it.
And I think that this kind of touches on something that we talked about in the beginning, where you kind of asked me what my mission was with some of the personal mentorship that I was doing. And it's really to make sure that fitness professionals and rehab professionals don't leave the field because they're burnt out. And I just think there are so many parallels of life, fitness, and business. And I'm using an attribute profile for that person. Tell me about why you feel burnt out. Tell me about why your schedule is set up the way it's set up. Tell me about the person that you want to help. Tell me about your old job. And then we're starting to make some parallels of, did you just put yourself in an old environment for safety? Like, you didn't take all this risk as an entrepreneur to be locked to your computer all day. So what are you looking to do?
I'd like to take a quick break from today's episode to tell you more about one of our sponsors. As all of you are well aware, the COVID-19 pandemic has been absolutely devastating for the fitness industry, with upwards of 1/3 of our clubs closing nationally on a permanent basis. One of the few stabilizing forces during this very tumultuous period of time has been IHRSA, the Global Trade Association for the health and fitness industry. On my crusade to make fitness professionals part of our healthcare continuum, the work that IHRSA is doing is absolutely vital. They provide advocacy and lobbying support at both the federal and the state level. They support state alliances in many ways, and they also provide resources and best practices to club owners, operators, and individual fitness professionals. Indeed, if we are truly going to become part of the healthcare continuum, we must speak with one unified voice. We must have best practices that we implement, and we must come together as an industry to ensure the public, the medical community, and lawmakers hear our message loud and clear, that movement is medicine and it is essential. That is the work that IHRSA is doing. They've recently revamped their membership structure, allowing large clubs, small clubs, boutiques, and individual professionals to join the organization for an appropriate price that allows them to have access to all of these many great resources and allows us to unify and amplify our voice as an industry. For more information on the amazing work that IHRSA is doing, go to their website, IHRSA.org. That's IHRSA.org, IHRSA.org, to look in a little bit further into the work IHRSA is doing to unify our industry, to move us closer to being a part of that healthcare continuum. Now back to today's episode. Yeah, let's stay on that for a second, because I feel like this has always been a challenge in our industry. I think contemporarily, it's even more of a challenge because of COVID, is just the exceedingly high turnover and burnout that we do see in our industry, and all the factors that lead to that. Inconsistent schedule, lack of benefits, unstable pay, and so on. When you talk with the professionals that you teach to and mentor, what are you hearing as the common, I guess we can call it mistakes, maybe, or gaps that need to be closed off to start to eliminate some of this burnout and move towards a career that's more stable and sustainable long-term?
I think number one is really figuring out your purpose in the industry, and letting that kind of drive what you're doing. And then number two is figuring out what are the things holding you back. So unfortunately, in the fitness space, there are a lot of norms that restrict earning opportunities for coaches. And that becomes really hard to navigate. And so it's, how do we restructure your contract with your current work environment to where it's a win-win? And understanding that if we can't restructure it, maybe we need to help you move facilities where you can start fresh and create a little bit more opportunity for yourself. Because the unfortunate part is if somebody is in, a rate split percentage, which is common in the industry, that becomes a big rate limiter, right? So you're telling me that when I raise my prices, I've got to take on 100% of the risk for 60, 70, 50% of the reward. That becomes a hard pill to swallow. And so I kind of started looking at this as like, well, how could I, as a physical therapist, go into somebody's facility and say, I'm a physical therapist. I'd like to rent space from you. And I'd like to, in part, make sure that I keep your ecosystem healthy. And for that reason, you should charge me less for being here, because I'm able to keep clients in your facility and on memberships longer. Like, how come I could do that, but coaches couldn't? Now, I've uncovered some of the reasons for that. But it was kind of this eye-opening, like, we can structure it to be more beneficial.
Yeah, very, very interesting. And I don't think many fitness professionals even think of that as an option. They just take it at face value. Oh, it's the 60-40 split, or it's the 50-50 split, or it's the 70-30 split. And that's a very interesting perspective to take on it. And it is part of the maturing of our profession and people like you out there that are teaching this to professionals. I want to start to switch gears. I feel like there's so many different topics that I want to talk about that we're just kind of going through the smorgasbord of different topics that I want to pick your brain on. I'm a programming nerd when it comes to exercise prescription. And I feel like we can go down a deep rabbit hole that I won't let us go all the way down, but start to talk about some of the things you teach from an actual programming perspective. Have that be just general programming principles, progression, individualization. I'm curious, given your experience and your background as a physical therapist, the lens that you look at the programming process through.
Yeah. So part of the attribute profile is essentially establishing a strength profile for a client, or understanding what the demands are needed for that client. So do we need to gain strength? If we need to gain strength, do we need to gain it unilaterally or bilaterally? Do we have, quote unquote, enough strength where bang for buck, we're not really getting the same return, kind of hit that point of diminishing returns? And do we need to focus on maybe barbell or, dumbbell endurance for somebody who's doing something like CrossFit? And from understanding that, we can then start to create the program that's more needs-based and saying, okay, your testing numbers showed X, Y, and Z, right? Maybe you did a back squat at, 8 reps, 240 pounds. Well, what is the goal? Is the goal to increase your back squat? All right, well, let's use that kind of as your buffer and build off there. Versus somebody who, let's say, has a strength discrepancy on their right leg versus their left leg. And with the same weight, they could do 12 reps on their left, 4 reps on their right. My programming process is going to be a little different for those people because I'm going to look at the discrepancy right to left as the limiter for progression to bilateral training. So I'm going to focus on the unilateral approach, and I use what I call kind of a feedback-based linear progression model, right? Or kind of this undulating progression model. Mm-hmm. And it's, what did the client say that they experienced? That is what drives my decision. So we look at like template-based programs. Those are all linear progression-based, and they work, but they work when they work. They don't take into account the context of the dose response to the client. So I really teach a lot about how did your client respond? And the biggest problem that I see is we are trying to progress things too fast, or we're not regressing things back far enough. And then we run into these issues and we wonder, well, why? Well, we weren't listening closely enough. We were just assuming. And that's really part of the process. I think any program works. It's the one that your client can stick to. My goal is to help create a program that your client can stick to.
Now, when you're getting that feedback from the client in terms of performance and just subjectively how they feel, what are you using for that? Do you use RPE? Do you use reps in reserve? Do you ask them questions? Some combination of all of that? Because I feel like that is, if there's one area, and I think you'll agree with this, where fitness professionals do miss the mark, is kind of the comprehensive evaluation of the overall training stress on an individual. So I'm curious to hear how you qualify and quantify that.
I use this kind of pause framework that I call it think like a chemist. You're trying to manipulate the formula to get a certain outcome. So what are the things that we can manipulate? We can manipulate the volume. We can do that in 2 ways. We can do more sets. We can do more reps. Okay, well, someone might respond better to lower sets, higher reps versus somebody opposite. We're looking at the language that we're using. So is my client interpreting RPE as I'm intending it? Or are they accidentally maxing out each time? Okay, well, how can I communicate that more clearly? I can switch to something like reps in reserve, or I can mesh the two, trying to educate them. Is my client highly skilled? Great, then maybe I'm going to use some percentage-based formulas. But I'm ultimately saying, what are the goals that we're looking to achieve? And that's going to help me choose, how do I implement some programming principles for that client?
That's great. Yeah. And what I heard from that is it's a very individualized experience. It is, you're going to use what that person best responds to be able to quantify that training stress. And what you said about templates, I think, is a very astute point, is that templates work until they don't. And most of the time, the don't part comes in with either A, injury, because they do progress too aggressively, or B, just lack of compliance because somebody gets bored with something that they're just not interested in. So I think there's a tremendous amount of value in not just jockeying templates for the client base that you work with. I do want to move on in the discussion because I think there's a couple other things that would be good to chat about with our audience, because I think you have some experience with this. Talk just a little bit about, maybe with regard to your framework, but just also your observations on the opportunity and maybe even the process to progress somebody who's maybe a more sedentary or deconditioned person from physical therapy to more of a fitness or an exercise-based setting. Because I think there's a great opportunity there. And I bet you have a lot of insight into what that process looks like.
I think it really comes down to the same thing of thinking like that chemist. But the variable here that we're looking to manipulate might be what's session duration. So I really think what happens is too often we're overdosing clients initially. And I think you see this in untrained individuals and trained individuals, right? You look at a modality like CrossFit, and oftentimes the thing that really entices people is that first workout being laid flat on their back.
Yeah.
To me, that's an overdose of the stimulus. And what that's done is it has now conditioned that person to think this is how it should feel every time I train. So if we look at that as the goal of somebody who's sedentary is figuring out why they haven't been able to maintain a fitness program. I don't think any program matters unless we can figure that out. And so if we understand that, we can then construct a custom solution that says like, oh, well, when you went to your first gym or your 10th gym, everybody had you come for an hour. Did they ask you about your goals? Did they ask you what fitness meant to you? Did they ask you about the micro problems that not having fitness in your life presented? We didn't create that emotional connection to fitness. And so instead of saying, well, Mike, you're going to come to the gym 3 times a week for an hour. Mike, come back tomorrow and let's talk about what your plan is. And let's move for 10 minutes. Does that sound less intimidating to you? Absolutely. Cool. The first phase is let's build that habit. Let's not dive too deep in and then they don't come back and they ghost us. And we're like, well, that person wasn't ready for change. Were they not ready for change, or did we not make the environment safe and supportive enough for them?
Yeah, that is such a good point. And I think we're constrained by the guardrails that typically exist in our systems, which is we sell our personal training sessions, and we have the 1 day a week pack, the 2 day a week pack, the 3 day a week pack. And I think we don't think of the negative consequence to that for people who aren't interested in being as physically active. But I think what I took out of what you said that I want to feather out for our audience to hear is, before you dive into, hey, you had a back issue that you just left the physical therapist for, let me understand all the pathophysiology of that. Not that that's not important, but you say, okay, let me understand you and what has caused you from leading an active lifestyle in the past. And let's start from there. So it all goes back to that individualization we talked about in the beginning of the episode.
It comes down to understanding the true problem and creating a custom solution for it. So you said something interesting of, being kind of confined by these constraints of how we sell stuff. Totally. So let's not worry about what we're going to sell until we know what the person needs.
Yeah.
And that's really the framework of the sales model that I teach is like, you're worried about the outcome, right? This comes back to that performance versus commitment. Let me tailor a package that works for you. And maybe I actually charge you the same thing as somebody else. Who cares if the time to deliver it is different?
Mm-hmm.
The way that I'm going to service you as a client is what matters. And the value, maybe we reconstruct what that hour looks like. Maybe instead of you being at the gym for an hour, it's a 15-minute workout and a 30-minute call. I know that doesn't add to an hour, but it doesn't need to. Does it solve the problem for that client? Maybe it's a follow-up the next day that says, hey, I'm actually going to split your session into 30 minutes at the gym, 30-minute for follow-up. If we don't use it, don't worry about it. Your client's not going to be, tallying the 15-minute increments because you're the first coach that's ever actually taken the time to figure out how to keep them in your facility.
Yeah, I love it. It's thinking outside of the box in a very customer service centric kind of way.
Yeah.
And what you said is very important. There are people, if you present it this way, people will think they're buying your time, which I think is a race to the bottom. If you present it from, they're buying your expertise, the relationship with you, and a given outcome, then you completely disassociate it from the time element, which gives you the flexibility to do the things you're talking about, which I think that is incredibly valuable information. And Ray, it's funny, like we start these episodes and we have a list of questions, and Ray knows I set them to ahead of time. And I say, we're not going to get through all the questions, and I never know where they're going to go. That might be the most valuable piece of information that we can give to our audience, is just the individualization that comes by thinking outside of the box and being very client service centric rather than just trying to stay within the narrow guardrails of the system.
I totally agree. And I think if we sell the process and explain why it's different, that sets you apart.
Yeah.
And time is part of your offering, and people value time. So use it as a value prop. You do get time with me, but more importantly, you get access.
Yeah.
You get navigation. You get feedback. You get guidance. That's the value proposition here.
Yeah, that's great, man. We've hit business lessons, we've hit coaching lessons, we've hit programming lessons. I feel like we can keep going forever, but I always try to be respectful of your time and our listeners' time. So before we get to the final question that I end the podcast on, tell our listeners where they can go to find out more about you and all the things you're doing.
So easiest way to connect with me is on Instagram, and that's at Ray Gorman DPT. And I'll make sure that I get you over that link.
Awesome.
And then if you want more information about my company, it's engagemovement.com.
Perfect. And we will link up to all that on the show notes page so you can reach out to Ray. Ray, this has been a spectacular conversation that we're going to bring to an end with a question that I'm very intrigued to ask you, because you have one foot kind of in the medical world and you have one foot in the fitness world. And for me, the thesis behind the wellness paradox is that there's a gap that exists between our fitness and wellness professionals and our medical professionals. And that's a gap we need to close off for many, many reasons. If you could give our listeners one piece of advice to close off that gap, what would it be?
The way that you wrote it and the way that you said it, I think changed my answer.
Oh dear.
I like it.
All
it's
right,
good.
Fair enough.
Think with abundance. Do not worry about what everyone else is doing or what any organization is helping you with or not helping you with. Go out and spread your message and attract your ideal client. And you will never be sorry you did that. We can't keep playing the waiting game.
Think with abundance. what I don't know what your answer was going to be before, but I think that is an incredibly solid thought to leave our audience with. Ray Gorman, thank you so much for joining us on the Wellness Paradox.
Thank you, Mike. Thanks for having me, man.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Ray as much as I did. If you found it insightful and informative, please do share with your friends and colleagues. Those shares make a massive difference for us. Any information we'd like to share with you from today's episode can be found on our website by going to wellnessparadoxpod.com/episode 47. Please be on the lookout for next week's episode when it drops on Wednesday. And if you have a moment, please do leave us a review on your favorite podcast platforms. Those reviews are critical for growing our podcast. Until we chat again next week, please be well.